Okay. Good evening from Pennsylvania, where it is now 7 p.m., and thank you all for joining us for the final panel in Acid Horizon Research Commons summer series of events. We're gathered here tonight for many reasons, chief among them our commitment to building a robust program of free public events that foster engagement with ideas beyond the walls of traditional academic institutions, an effort that has produced a genuine convergence between para-academic spaces and scholars conducting research within the university. Tonight's panel features two scholars who have not only successfully bridged that divide, but have done so within the context of our own research collective, appearing on multiple episodes of Acid Horizon and teaching courses during the fledgling first year of the Acid Horizon Research Commons. And before I introduce our panelists this evening, I want to extend my sincere thanks to our Patreon supporters and to everyone who helped make the past two seasons of Acid Horizon Research Commons an overwhelming success. That gratitude extends, of course, to the remarkable and deeply committed instructors whose courses so many of you have enjoyed over the past several months. I'd also like to thank Adam Jones and Emma Stam, both of whom have been invaluable collaborators and who in recent weeks hosted outstanding panel discussions of their own. But my deepest thanks goes to those of you who invested in our course series, those who believe in our vision of creating a thriving alternative to today's increasingly precarious academic landscape, one that supports instructors, sustains important intellectual work, and makes that work broadly accessible to the public, and that is Acid Horizon Research Commons. So, Acid Horizon, we first met Tyrique Mack-Georges as an undergraduate on the podcast in early 2022, where he introduced the research interests he now pursues at Penn State University. Joining him this evening is Professor Nicolas de Warren, also of Penn State, whom I likewise came to know in recent years. One might call this a bit of Penn State nepotism, given that I'm also an alumnus of the university's philosophy program. It's a much more innocuous situation than that, actually. Having returned to Happy Valley in recent years, I have had the pleasure of working with a remarkable confluence of local artists and intellectuals, both in person and online, who have embraced the expansive vision of this podcast and its many endeavors. This past spring, Nicolas led a course titled Worlds Without Us, beginning with Günther Anders' long-neglected The Obsolescence of the Human, before moving through Baudrillard's theory of simulacra and hyperreality, and finally into speculative fiction, all in pursuit of a single question. If the human has become obsolete, who or what is left to notice? Also, last month, Tyrique taught a course titled The Wretched of the Earth and Fanon's Dialectical Philosophy, reading Fanon alongside Sartre's critique of dialectical reason to trace the threads of praxis, culture, violence, and the invention of a new humanity, which is one of Fanon's premier concepts. And by all means, if you have not taken these courses, please subscribe to our archive and delve into them after tonight's discussion. Now, thinking at the intersection of Fanon and Anders is a project we had not previously considered, and perhaps we here tonight are among the first to place these figures into sustained dialogue. Fanon warned against the false universalism generated by colonized subjects, reproducing colonial structures and recapitulating their logic. For Fanon, the restoration of human dignity requires rejecting spurious racial hierarchies and colonial forms of domination through both militant struggle and a transformation of human relations. His vision of a new humanity advances a universalism tethered to an egalitarian political project, one that dismantles the economic and psychological armature through which oppression reproduces itself. But what Fanon may not have fully anticipated, however, was the technological revolution already underway and the emergence of a new paradigm with what we might call its own revolutionary aspirations, a paradigm that called into question the very capacity for transformative agency demanded by the revolutionary project he himself envisioned. The work of Günther Anders, now finally enjoying renewed attention in the Anglophone world, explores the many developments in technology and media, not only how they undermine our understanding of what it means to be human, but also, as Anders argues, produce what he calls Promethean shame, a collective diminishment before technology's superior capacities, the realization that the technological edifice we have created has outgrown its creator, rendering the human increasingly obsolete, and by extension, casting doubt on prospects for a revolutionary humanity. With the work of Fanon and Anders in view, we would like to put forward a series of questions for this evening. Here are the questions in mind. Can Fanon's vision of a new humanity endure the technological condition diagnosed by Anders, especially as artificial intelligence expands into nearly every dimension of digital life? How have contemporary technologies, from algorithmic governance to new forms of social mediation, reshaped the forms of domination that Fanon sought to overcome? Which means, in what ways have colonial logics been extended through the contemporary political economy of venture capital and artificial intelligence? And the last question is, if Anders is correct that technological modernity induces a sense of human obsolescence, what resources, if any, remain for imagining political emancipation? Can a genuinely universal humanity still be conceived under conditions in which technology increasingly mediates and perhaps eclipses human agency? Or does the answer lie in thinking beyond the human as we have traditionally understood it? Tyrique and Nicolas, welcome, and thank you both for joining us. I'd like to begin by inviting each of you to offer some orienting remarks, but also to introduce yourselves and your work in a little bit greater depth. And we'll begin with Tyrique, because within the framework of tonight's discussion, the quote unquote revolution, as most people would imagine it, appears as the challenger in this debate, while for better or for worse, technology enters as the reigning champion. So, Tyrique, welcome.
Thank you, Craig, for hosting us tonight. For those of you who don't know, I'm Tyrique. I'm a PhD student at Penn State. I'm currently working on a dissertation project on Sartre and Fanon, particularly in relation to their methodology and what it might have to offer for some particularly important questions. I've known Nicolas for quite a while, and so I'm quite excited to have this conversation. Aside from maybe a few orienting remarks, I think it might be useful maybe to kind of allow the other folks in the room to also introduce themselves, if that's okay, Craig.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe we could start with Alexander.
Yeah, sure. If any of you would like to unmute and just say hello and maybe express why you might be here tonight, please do so.
My name is Alex. I'm displaying as Alexander, but my name is Alex. I'm here because some of my own work on revolutionary subjectivity vis-a-vis music and the arts has a real impact. What's being discussed tonight has a real impact on it. On top of simply being a very big fan of Acid Horizon and having listened to the contributions that both Nicolas and Tyrique have made. I think I'll certainly be asking some questions later. I'd reckon, but I'll stop there.
All right, cool. Ben Eku.
Oh, hey, I'm Ben. I'm in Missoula, Montana, and was in the Anders class recently, which was great, and just can't get enough. So,
Nice.
back.
All right, Adam. Nice to see you again, Adam.
Hey there. Hi, I'm Adam. I'm a PhD at Penn State in Comp Lit. I also was in the Anders class, and I found it really exciting. But Anders and Baudrillard are, kind of a downer, uh, and I find Fanon really uplifting, but in a murderous way. And so I'm excited to.
Cool. Ben.
Sorry, is this okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, the other Ben. Yeah.
Okay,
Sorry.
cool. Sorry, my audio's been on a blink. Hi, my name is Ben, and I am a PhD at the University of Birmingham, UK. And I also partook in Professor Warren's class, which was fantastic. Good, I missed Tyrique's. So incredibly interested in splicing this, especially because of my own research into science fiction and its own particular relationship, dialectical or otherwise, with a form of colonized alterity, often couched within a technological imagination, which still traffics with. So yeah, really cannot wait to hear this discussion, and just want to say massive thank you to the folks over at Asset Horizon for letting me join up anyways.
You're welcome.
Cruz.
Hey y'all, what's up? So my name is Cruz, and I'm from San Antonio, and I'm an anarchist and a PhD student. And so I joined. I wasn't in any like group, but I saw the Fanon, and I got excited, and so I was like, heck yeah. And I was in the anti-Oedipus um reading group, and so that's how I saw y'all in the Discord chat.
Excellent. Thank you for joining us. I know there's some folks with their video muted, and we want to respect some folks if they just want to kind of cruise beneath the radar privately. But if there's anybody else who'd like to introduce themselves, feel free to do so at this time. Otherwise, shall we get started? Tyrique, do you want to take it away?
Yeah. So yeah, so again, thanks again everyone for coming through, and Craig, thanks for hosting this conversation. I mean, I want to start, I guess, maybe by saying a few things about how this came to be. You know, because I imagine folks are wondering, why are we having this conversation between, you know, these two authors, where, you know, aside from, you know, a few bibliographic evidence that, you know, suggests that Fanon obviously read Günther Anders's famous essay on the pathology of freedom, that there's no real, you know, way in which, you know, we know that these two figures would have interacted with each other, right? And so, you know, why is it that we're kind of gathered here to talk about the two, aside from some of the things Craig had already said, you know? Well, you know, taking us aback a bit, before either Nicolas or I had a course, you know, over a few months, you know, Nicolas and I, you know, a few office hour conversations here and there, we were really interested in about what kind of possibility for change still exists within our technological age, right? And, you know, we had these, you know, back and forth for, you know, every time we would kind of see each other. And, you know, as those conversations continued to happen organically, you know, we both got the opportunity to teach these two courses that Craig was talking about, right? So, you know, Nicolas told me he was going to be teaching his course on Anders, you know, looking closely at his philosophy of Promethean shame, thinking particularly about, you know, mass media, cybernetics, nuclear war, and in particular, how all those things that human beings are making are equally in the product, you know, in the project of unmaking humanity as such, right? And, you know, he asked me, oh, you know, what are you teaching? And I was like, well, you know, I'm teaching this class on Fanon, and we're going to be talking, you know, as Craig was saying earlier, about praxis, culture, and violence, and in particular, how those things are kind of, you know, organized or oriented toward the production of a new human, right? And so, you know, we thought that this would be, you know, the best time, you know, given, you know, these two things that we were talking about, and given the kind of organic conversations, you know, me and Nicolas were having, to kind of have this open discussion about, you know, revolution and the technological age. And we thought it'd particularly be apt to have it in this medium, right? You know, with the, not just with the learning commons, but, you know, in this space that's, you know, so highly characterized by the digital, right? This kind of digital public that I think, you know, Craig and all the work you've been doing has kind of been at the forefront and trying to, you know, uplift. And so, you know, that's kind of a rough sense as to the reason why, you know, we're here to talk to each other. But, you know, I mean, I think aside from that, you know, there are a few other things, right? You know, I think both Nicolas and I, you know, we're in full agreement that a lot of the folks who are interested, I think, in Fanon's work, particularly in his work on revolutionary group formation, and the creation of a new human, I think those kinds of people, the people working in critical philosophy of race, decolonial theory, Black studies, etc., those are precisely the people who I think could learn a lot about some of the things that Anders has to say about, you know, the technological dangers facing this project, right? I think I've gotten, I've learned a great deal just kind of talking to Nicolas about those things. And then conversely, we've also, through our conversations, come to see that, the kinds of people interested in Anders, right? The people working in the emerging fields of, digital humanities, mass media studies, philosophy of technology. I think, and I think Nicolas too thinks that there are some things that Fanon has to offer that may or may not kind of offer, work as a, I think Adam was saying earlier that Anders and Baudrillard are kind of doomer, that, Fanon might have something to say beyond just mere fatal strategies, right? What different ways we might want to think about technological change, right? And so, but I think, most importantly, aside from those two things, I think, if we just look out in the world we're living in right now, we're living at a time where the issues of racism, colonialism, those things are starting to swell beyond proportions that I think are eclipsing even the things that, Fanon was thinking about. And we're living in a time increasingly where the kinds of risks that Anders was, raising in his work are just continuing to be ignored, right? If we look at, all the things happening in Silicon Valley, we're kind of dealing with these two particular problems, right? And I think aside from, the differences that, Anders and Fanon might share, I think Nicolas and I really want to think through, this moment, right? This moment where these two problems are, really at the fore, and think that through two figures who've kind of thought about those two problems independently of each other, but, to great extent. And so, I think aside from all the great questions that Craig's already put on the table, I think the big thing we mostly want to get out of this is just figuring out, or maybe coming to some schematic conclusions about what it is that change in this, digital technological age might look like, right? And so, I'll probably say a few things about, Fanon and revolution, and I imagine Nicolas will say a few things about Anders and technology, but, that's really the kind of orienting reason for us kind of gathering to talk. I don't know if Nicolas wants to say much else.
Yeah, I'll just add a few thoughts. And hi, I'm Nicolas. I teach here at Penn State, and the gang of three of Penn Staters here. So, as Tyrique mentioned, even though there's no direct connection between Anders and Fanon, and they're really operating in two very different concerns, both can be seen as philosophers of unfreedom. So both are really concerned with, in the present historical circumstance, 1950s, 2027, to diagnose and think through the conditions that inhibit the capacity of human beings to be human. So this is the sense in which they are thinkers of unfreedom. In Fanon's context, it's specifically colonialism, racism, as fundamentally the organization of a world in which a certain group, in fact, the majority of the population in those worlds, are prohibited from access to the human. Indeed, Fanon strikingly formulates it, are inhibited from having a life at all. They are in a condition of unlivability, or the living dead, as Fanon diagnoses it. In a similar way, Anders is also concerned with diagnosing the contemporary conditions of unfreedom, not in the context of colonialism and racism, which obviously is Fanon's context, but in the way in which increasingly our world is being saturated by new kinds of technologies, first and foremost media technology, which in a sense are establishing a world in which the human, and this is the title of his book, becomes obsolete, where the condition of human freedom, which is in a sense, technology arises as an expression of human freedom, because human beings, part of their essence of freedom is to change the world and to make things to change the world, to make it a world in which it's habitable for human beings. But paradoxically, as Tyrique said, the things that we make, which on the one hand seem to express our Promethean freedom, actually unmake us. And so another way to understand the text or the title, The Obsolescence of the Human, it's the obsolescence of the political, that increasingly we are in a world in which spaces for political action in the pursuit of the collective realization of freedom become foreclosed because of how that world is structured in terms of communication. Now, Anders was obviously not thinking specifically of the digital. He wasn't alive and didn't exist as a reality, but he did understand that the tendency that he sees, especially with television, radio, and the emerging conception of cybernetics, really leads to a situation which I'm not saying that Anders is a prophet, but he understands the sort of the tendency, what the French philosopher of technology Simondot calls technological tendencies. And these tendencies then become materialized in different ways in their milieu, but the tendency seems to be there. So the idea is, to put it to a point, is it still possible to meaningfully change the world in some progressive, politically advantageous direction for the manifestation of collective human freedom in a world in which increasingly the material conditions for political action become foreclosed? And so that's one of the questions we thought is interesting, because, of course, the whole revolutionary fervor to transform the world and create a new sense of the human and a new political society animates the struggle of Fanon, both theoretically as a thinker and also practically, I mean, as himself involved in the Algerian anti-colonial movement. Likewise, in Anders, though he doesn't obviously have this practical component in his own existence, his form of writing is very much that kind of praxis. And maybe one last introductory remark, just to sort of set the complex set of questions that we thought we would discuss with all of you. Another way to understand a kind of uncanny or indirect connection between Fanon and Anders is that part of this search for a new way to think the human under contemporary conditions of unfreedom requires rethinking what philosophy is as an activity. And who is the philosopher? Is it the militant? Is it someone like Anders who, gave up an academic career and chose a kind of another path? And connected to that is, what is the language that we have to use? So another subtext of the obsolescence of the human is that the vocabulary that we've inherited, the theoretical vocabulary in philosophy, including for Anders, and this will be sort of the point of contention, the word revolution itself has become obsolete. So all of this vocabulary that we have, revolution, resistance, praxis, etc., might be a vocabulary that no longer truly has attraction on our world because the world has changed materially. Likewise, Fanon is also searching for a new vocabulary. That's part of his, brilliant sort of eclecticism, that, we need a new vocabulary to diagnose not only the condition of colonialism, but also to provide a vocabulary for the regeneration of the human. And for those of you, and this will be my last little comment, familiar with Black Skins, White Mask, it's, on the one hand, it begins with a discussion of language and then moves to a question of the body. So it's language and the body. There needs to be a kind of reincorporation or re-embodiment of the body individually and collectively, but that also requires a new kind of language in which we become incorporated as speaking political agents. So that's another really indirect kind of resonance between Anders and Fanon. And that's why we thought, Tyrique and I, we have these discussions, but since we taught these two classes, it's an interesting discussion in that context, and also just an interesting discussion because, and this just gets back to the beginning, as Craig mentioned, I don't think anyone has ever seen that there's a real fruitfulness to the encounter between Fanon and Anders, even though they seem to be worlds apart.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you both. Well, speaking of both surmounting and superseding vocabularies and concepts, maybe we can spell out just very briefly some of the operative concepts in both Fanon and Anders' work. And we'll start with Tyrique, given the fact that Fanon himself is struggling against what would be called a false universalism. How does Fanon use his concept of a new humanity to upend the reproduction of colonial subjectivity, and how does he see this confluence of the body, language, the psychological dimension of human life being integrated, as a sort of holistic mechanism for revolution?
Yeah, so I mean, maybe, and I think this might be to kind of pick up on some things Nicolas just said, right? That part of what we might need to do is, investigate the terms we've inherited. And I think it's important to note that I think for thinking about some of the operative concepts in Fanon's vocabulary, those are very much inherited terms, right? Although, yes, he is there very much trying to think through what a new human might look like. In the same way anyone does anything novel, they're going to draw on their, sources that they're familiar with. And I think, Nicholas has kind of already given voice to this. I think the key concept, at least to my mind, that's at work, and I think the concept that Fanon's definitely inheriting from a particular tradition is that of praxis, right? And in particular, obviously praxis has this long history in Marxist vocabulary, but in particular, for those of you who know, or kind of heard me talk about Fanon in the past, he's getting this concept from Sartre, and particularly Sartre's critique of dialectical reason, where Sartre means something quite specific about praxis, in which I think Fanon equally adopts and then kind of carries things out with respect to these other concepts I'll name, that being culture and violence. But to kind of put to kind of give a kind of nutshell reading of it, by praxis, what Fanon means is, we exist in a particular world, a world shaped by certain material conditions that I think, to Nicholas's point, definitely constrain our ability to be and exist as humans, right? So we exist in these particular conditions, and what praxis is about, praxis names the act of negating those conditions, right, as they presently exist, as they presently exist to ossify, individuals from each other, as they presently exist to unmake human beings, negating those conditions, and in reorganizing those conditions in relation to a different project, a project that moves closer towards, a moment or a space in which, human beings share a world, right? And so if it is the case that, in the colonial situation, the masses find themselves, ossified from each other, right? That's not a coincidence, right? That they live in a material situation in which it precisely functions that, the masses, the intellectuals, the peasantry, and to some extent as well, the colonized, each, kind of make up parts of this population. Each of them are incapable of kind of seeing and viewing each other as fellow human beings. And the task of praxis, and part of the reason why this needs to be, not just an individual praxis, but, again, borrowing on some language from Sartre, group praxis, a praxis that does this work of, bringing together a particular ensemble. It's kind of getting them to move from seeing their material conditions as the means by which they're separated, and then coming to see their material conditions as the means by which they can come together, right? And so I think the kind of core concept at work with Fanon is praxis. And he moves from this then to kind of think, I think, at two registers, at least in The Wretched of the Earth. And one register, I think the most famous one, obviously, comes out in the first chapter, and I think to a greater degree in the fifth chapter. One register of that is violence, right? And so I was saying a moment ago that the material conditions in which the colonized finds themselves are ones of separation, ossification. One of the means by which that happens is by finding themselves situated in a immediately violent situation, right? A situation that was brought into being by the original violence of, settler colonialism, in the case of, the French coming to Algeria, a situation that reenacts that original form of violence through the passive activity of, the living colonists. And the task, Fanon basically gives, not just the colonized, but, I think a task he's also kind of giving some people in the metropole, and I think this is part of the reason why he has Sartre write the preface, is the task of praxis is to take hold of that, violent situation and make that situation speak in relation to, a repressed humanity, a humanity that's, constantly being repressed through the violence of, not just the individual colonists, but the colonial system, right? And so that's at one level in which, Praxis is going to move from, and in particular, he's going to describe this as having a kind of cleansing power, cleansing force, insofar as the colonial system, as Fanon explains in Black Skin, White Mass, does this work of setting up this, immediate binary whereby the colonist understands and interprets themselves as superior, and the colonized understands and interprets themselves as inferior. This kind of revolutionary praxis of violence is a cleansing force insofar as it kind of removes any such kind of immediate binary and sees that this relation in general is always being mediated by a material system, right? A material system that can conform to neither the superiority of the colonist or the inferiority of the colonized, but to, the life, a shared life of a new human, right? And so that's the level at which I think violence is operative. And I think the material conditions, I think, are quite interesting. And that might have some interesting interface with some of the things we might want to say about technology. But that's the level at which violence operates. And I want to say one more thing now about culture, which I think is equally important. And I think also might have something to say about what kind of culture we're trying to produce in, say, a digital space, right? Which is to say, well, he thinks particularly about praxis as this negation of alienating material contexts towards reciprocal shared contexts, and he thinks one of the other ways we get through to that is at the level of culture, right? And he has famously these three phases of culture, right? He talks particularly about this assimilationist phase of culture where the colonized person really finds themselves kind of immediately wrapped up in the values of the West, right? I was just saying a moment ago that the colonial system is one in which an imposition of inferiority is kind of, diffused and spread among the population. And so the writers at that level try their best to replicate, what the Western, writers are doing, right? Whether it's surrealism, symbolism, etc. And that's one level at which culture operates. The next level is what he calls pre-combative literature, right? And this is where the colonist, no longer looks directly at the West, but tries to look at the pre-colonial, situation, tries to draw on, resources from their own history, right? Their own history that's been, repressed from them to kind of speak, the truth of that culture, right? And that's, I think, represented best by the negritude movement, writers like Aimé Césaire, Senghor, and whatnot. And he thinks that he calls this pre-combative because it's makes one step beyond purely assimilationist literature. But the thing he calls combat literature, this last step, is one in which doesn't draw upon either Western values or Western ideas about what the human should be, doesn't draw on, say, Renaissance or bourgeois humanism. And it's also not a culture. It's also not a form of culture that's going to draw on an idea of the human that existed in some pre-colonial past, right? Although he thinks that it's an important phase that one recognizes the truth of that past. He doesn't think what is properly going to be speaking called combat literature will operate at that level. What he's going to call combat literature, again, has to be attentive to the material situation, right? Has to be attentive to speaking and writing about what kind of unfree situations the colonist and colonized are living in, and are going to speak a new reality into being, right? That's the thing he calls combat literature. And I think part of the relevance there, again, thinking at the level of material conditions, there's a lot of talk, I think, about digital culture, right? And what is it that digital culture is going to be and look like? And I think if we want to think about change at the level of digital culture, it has to be the case that if digital culture is going to be combative in the way that Fanon talks about it, it's not going to it can't draw its resources on what was previously combative, in other spaces, right? Nor can it, try to harness some kind of, example of what the space could have been, say, right at the time of the dot-com boom. Instead, I think digital culture, if it's going to truly be combative, it's going to have to speak to what kind of things us as, netizens are dealing with, right? And so those are just, I think, at least to my mind, some kind of orienting schematic remarks. And I think, again, I really want to stress that this is a lexicon that, doesn't just kind of fall out of the sky. Again, drawing on the thing Nicolas was saying a moment ago, this is very much a lexicon Franz inheriting, right? And particularly inheriting from a particular tradition. A tradition I think has a long history of kind of thinking through how it is that, our material conditions are always unmaking us, but at the same time are always as near things, the things by which, we can always be remade. And so those are just, I think, just some opening thoughts I have there at the level of concepts.
All right. Thank you, Tyrique. Well, it was several months ago, maybe even at the beginning of this year, when Nicolas and I had a discussion about the new translation of The Obsolescence of the Human done by Christopher Muller, which is an excellent translation. And it was also around that time that I was truly introduced to the work of Günther Anders and his premier concept of Promethean shame, which I touched on in the introduction. And I will leave it to Nicolas to sort of explain in detail what Promethean shame is. I mean, the short version is that we've created technology in such a way as to be outmoded by our own creation. And I would like to know, one of the challenges of even doing this kind of conversation is that if it is, apologies, sorry about that. If it is indeed the case that for Anders, that this new era of Promethean shame or this new existential reality means that we can no longer imagine what we produce because the things that are producing have outmoded us in some way or have constructed this gap between making and imagining a new future. Does this in any way preempt or disable Fanon's call to a militant world-making kind of praxis? Or does it mean for Anders that we must relocate where that praxis has to happen? And I think a sort of natural progression that we might imagine is, and here we are living, decades in the wake of Anders writing this, we have somebody like Baudrillard who presents this concept of fatal strategies or revolt as an alternative to the revolution with a capital R. Maybe we can touch upon how Anders' concept of Promethean shame or the world as phantom and matrix plays into the possibility of some kind of action that could transform humanity or post-humanity? Or is it the case that all of those avenues have been absolutely foreclosed?
Yeah, that's a great set of questions. And maybe I'll just add, also continuing with sort of what Tyrique introduced about Fanon. Now, from the questions that you're asking about Anders, the first thing I think that's important is that especially in the German tradition, the figure of Prometheus is the figure of revolution. There's a very, perhaps the most important statement, the restatement of the Prometheus myth is in a poem by Goethe. Goethe writes a poem where he interprets Prometheus almost as the quintessential figure of the French Revolution and the advancement of human culture that rejects tutelage and the gods. So on the one hand, there's a kind of German Enlightenment appropriation of Prometheus with a very emphatic political statement where the gods are precisely the aristocracy, the established situation of power. And in Goethe, it's not so much technology, but much more broadly culture as such. And this is the whole project of Bildung in the German context, that culture, the development of culture, is the vehicle for the realization of human flourishing, freedom by another name. The other important appropriation of Prometheus in the German context, and I'm mentioning the German context because the notion of Promethean shame that Anders fashions is, among other things, really a kind of another stage in the evolution and the appropriation of the Promethean myth in the German context of political thinking, and in a sense is a kind of reply. The other one is in Marx.
Yeah.
In Marx as well, Prometheus is the figure that emphasizes the capacity of labor, technology for revolutionary ends. And this is, not so unsurprisingly why the first real philosophers of technology are Marxists. Ernst Knapp, in the German context, writes a book called Philosophie der Technik. He was a kind of left-wing Hegelian, but perhaps more importantly, are Soviet thinkers in the early 20s who are. So if Prometheus is the Enlightenment figure of revolutionary change through technology, because technology is the capacity to change the world and emancipate the human, the idea of Promethean shame inverts that. And that's going to be the Anders claim, is that in the contemporary context of technology after the Second World War, again, specifically, he's looking at media technology on the one hand and the development of atomic weapons on the other. We'll focus on media, that now our relationship technology is not as the promise of emancipation, but precisely that we now make objects that usurp our freedom. And Anders' thesis is that the veritable agents of history are not the human, but the machine. Now, this is interesting because this is already a kind of Anthropocene thesis, but in a very different form. That we have the capacity to transform nature, but in so doing, it displaces our own centrality. And the idea is that the only things that really have history are not human beings, but the things that we make. So that's the sense in which then we always have a sense of inferiority and shame vis-a-vis these technical artifacts, and we compensate by trying to accommodate who we are to those machines. So fitness equipment, I think, is a great example of that, because fitness equipment is precisely, I have a machine, and the more and more, so I have a machine that I feel ashamed of because it's capable of doing something that my body isn't. But then the more and more I use that fitness machine, the more I overcome my shame vis-a-vis the machine and adapt myself to the machine by moving up the levels, et cetera, et cetera. The other aspect of Promethean shame, which is really interesting, because Anders has this idea of developing a kind of political history of emotions, is that part of the Promethean shame is also we have no sense of what are the proper emotions, almost in a Heideggerian sense, the kind of Stimmungen that attunes us to a world. And here, again, another example would be something like AI or robots. Like we don't have the right sense of how do we fit into a world in which we realize that we are not at the center of this world because of robots, because of AI, even though these are paradoxically things that we, in a sense, have made. So that's the aspect of the idea of Promethean shame. And then it connects to the very strong thesis, and I'll formulate it this way. It's sort of the thesis that technological artifacts are the, if you wish, historical transcendental conditions for how we relate to the world, to each other, and our capacity to act. So Fanon already articulates what Bernard Stiegler calls the technological unconscious, that the very condition for being in the world is some kind of technology, whether it's writing, whether it's television, whether it's now we're on the internet. And this constrains for Anders the way in which the world appears to us, but also the way in which we communicate to each other, and therefore this basis of action. So I'll just say one last point, because this connects also, this is the elaboration of the Promethean shame, is that Anders takes sort of Arendt's conception of the political. The political is the space in which we appear to each other in the context of acting collectively in order to realize and flourish as human beings, and also the way in which we speak to each other. This is, let's call it the public space in the Arendtian sense. And this has a kind of technological condition. Now, it's interesting that Tyrique had mentioned what Fanon calls combat literature, combat culture. Here, in one sense, reflecting also Sartre's "What is literature?" That, you know, the point of the writer is not to represent the world. It is to incite a transformation in the consciousness of the reader to change the world. So just as one could say the emergence of modern democracies, conceptions of freedom, the public sphere, as Habermas argued, presupposes a certain material culture of communication, which is the print media and the book, and a certain kind of literacy, the literacy that we're all involved in. We're writing books, we're reading books, we're getting PhDs, etc. Precisely that now has been transformed, according to Anders, because we are no longer a culture where the dominant technology of communication and appearing is no longer the written word or the spoken word. It's going to be the televised image. Or in our contemporary context, we are a kind of televised image because I'm looking at you folks, you're looking at us. And, you know, we are each in our own little world, somehow appearing and speaking to each other. So part of what's interesting is the obsolescence of the human has different sort of inflection points. Another way to think about it's the obsolescence of literacy and the obsolescence of the culture of the book, and therefore the combat culture, which is precisely the vehicle that Fanon. So it's both the end of space of action, but also the kind of vehicle by which something like action becomes incited or catalyst. And of course, this is even much more of a predicament for us today in a world of AI than it was for Anders.
Yeah, just thinking about your comments, I really think there's a way that the Anders Fanon combo can really traction here with just encapsulating it in the phrase the obsolescence of combat culture. And with that said, we're about 10 minutes away from the top of the hour. I'm going to just present like one more big question, and I'll give you both a chance to go at it, and then maybe we'll open up the rest for discussion here. I'm going to try to bring in some of the threads that are already kind of hanging out there, and also go for the gusto at the same time, which is talking about AI and venture capitalism today. And from the perspective of both Fanon and Anders, can we look at the current AI venture capital build out as a new form of colonization in Fanon's sense, and not being glib, and of course understanding that historical colonization involved a kind of violence that for some of us seems almost unimaginable today. Yet, with that said, extraction of labor, data, and land from the global periphery, rare earth minerals, and everything else, the building of data centers recapitulates a lot of that colonial logic, not only in the sort of material and economic sense, but pointing to what Nicolas says in a sort of affective sense as well, where the imposition of technology creates, you know, what Deleuze would call dividualities, you know, where we're responding not only to specific impulses generated by our technology, whether it's something as simple as picking up your phone because you received a notification, or, you know, checking your social media as a kind of habit, or making even something like, you know, responding to emails a sort of daily or weekly ritual or what have you. All of those things compound to create a kind of digital subjectivity. And so what I'd like to know is from both of you, like, where does the analogy hold? Where does it break down between colonization and this new paradigm of data extraction and surveillance that comes out of AI and venture capital today? And we'll start with Tyrique.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe can add another, if we could add another analogy or story to, I guess, to the mix. You know, what comes to my mind in particular, and I think Nicolas and I have often talked about this as well. I think where I think where you really see Fanon and Anders, you know, together is you know, they're both really interested, at least in their times, in different forms of telecommunication, right? So Anders at the level of the television, and, you know, Fanon has this little essay, you know, Dying Colonialism, on the radio. And, you know, in thinking about that, one of the things that I think is pretty instructive. Is that, at least to my mind, when I read that essay, what Fanon really seems to be suggesting is that, we can be a bit too quick to assume whether or not, a piece of technology, is going to be revolutionary or not, right? I mean, it obviously is the case that, no piece of technology is neutral, right? And this comes up in that essay where he's thinking about, in particular, this broadcast that was, around in the 50s called Radio Algiers, right? This is a broadcast that was kind of basically, the French broadcasting system stationed in Algeria, giving updates on the war from the French perspective, right? And part of the reason why the colonized ended up here, ended up having a radio and initially turning to that is that they were going to, get an older piece of technology, the newspaper, and they weren't, they quickly found that they weren't able to get the newspaper, because if they were getting the newspaper, then they could, go back to their comrades and talk about strategy and whatnot. There was the other attempt of having the little children in Algeria go buy the newspaper. You often see this if you've ever seen the Battle of Algiers. There's lots of examples of that in that film, and obviously the French caught wind of that as well, and so the masses and the militants alike all had to turn to this radio thing to get updates on what was going on. And it was in interfacing with that piece of technology, that they learned, okay, well, maybe we could use this as a way to communicate our message. And it was through that medium that something like the Voice of Algeria was born, right? And, that was, updates coming from the perspective of the revolutionaries, telling them about all the victories that are being won and whatnot. And even when the French caught hold of it, and I think this gets into something you were just saying a moment ago, Craig, about, the way in which we relate to our technologies, either passively or actively. Once the French got a hold of it, they were trying to jam the signal, right? Often trying to jam the signal. And that meant that, if you were an Algerian, you really had to actively listen to what the radio was emitting. You really had to actively, take hold of what this piece of technology was trying to say, and take the bits of information you were getting and use that to then go on to transform your context. And it was at that moment where the people started to realize that this broadcast, Radio Algeria, we were relating to passively, that was kind of subordinating us to this our own unmaking, right? That broadcast was coming from a medium that itself can always be used, if we turn to it and relate to it actively, as the means by which we can go out and dismantle it. And Sartre has another example of this as well. If you look at Volume 1 of the Critique in Volume 2, where he talks about the radio as this kind of serializing or ossifying object, and then in Volume 2 he talks about what it is that Castro did to get the Cubans organized, which is similar to the kind of thing that Fanon just described. And I bring that up to say that obviously our situation with AI is not exactly the same, but I think, and it's obviously not the case that data centers and AI itself is anything that we can say we exist immediately neutrally in relation to, right? It's obvious that this thing is doing a form of unmaking to us. But I think the instructive point that I think Fanon makes in that essay that I was just mentioning is that, it's not up to us to decide on our own, just individually, whether or not a piece of technology is always going to work in one way, right? It very much can be the case, and Fanon, the way Fanon describes it, and I mean, it seems silly to us, but I think for the folks in 1950, magically, these are the words he uses, like magically, it's this thing that was subordinating us became the very means by which we recognized and came to understand and interpret our own agency. I don't know what that would look like with respect to, AI technology and whatnot, but it doesn't seem to me that the conversations around it really have this ambiguity, for lack of a better word, in mind. And I think, to my mind, that's what I think is perhaps quite necessary at this moment. If we want to think about how it is that we can respond to this as a holdout, right? You were using this analogy of technology as a form of colonialism. as an instrument of that. Well, if it is, just like any other material condition, how is it that we can negate it as it presently exists to, give birth and give rise to something, that exists for us? Right? How is it that we can no longer be serving, its ends, but, continue to serve, properly speaking, human ends? And those are just some thoughts I have.
Yeah, maybe I'll just sort of speak from the Anders point. I mean, Anders has a very complicated relationship to Marxism. In a sense, his book is a kind of rejection or an alternative to a Marxist critique of technology. But it is also, in its own way, a diagnosis of capitalism in its advanced form. As Frederick Jameson would say, late capitalism is fundamentally about consumer society and consumption.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what drives hand in hand consumer culture and media. We are consumers of information and ourselves are consumed by information. Mm-hmm. So this is something that Anders already has a sensitivity to, of what today we would call the attention economy. And that, it's not just me consuming images and videos, but in a sense, the videos are consuming my attention. And that's the true capital. So in a sense, if we ask ourselves, what is the form of capital in the idea or the phenomenon of AI venture capitalism? It's information, it's data. And that's something which we sort of think that we are freely using the internet for mm-hmm. our own jouissance, mm-hmm. for our own pleasure, without realizing that this is an extraction machine of our identities, of our data, etc. So Anders obviously doesn't describe it in this specific form, but he does describe the relationship of a viewer to television as someone who is in a kind of involuntary servitude, voluntary servitude, excuse me, that, unbeknownst to them, they think that this is a realization of their freedom. I get to see whatever TV show I want without realizing that I'm sort of the servant of the media. So in that sense, the venture capitalism is that the commodity which has the greatest capital return is data and information. And that also presupposes that we have a reduction of meaning to information. Mm-hmm. So this is also something that Anders sees very clearly, that the theories of information which come out of Norbert Wiener and Claude Shannon, who are the two great information theorists who set the framework for what cybernetics, that this is a massive transformation of the category of meaning itself. We no longer speak of meaning, we speak of information. And the reduction or translation of any sense of meaning to information is the condition for the monetization of meaning. Because now I have information, now I have data, I can sell it, I can make it into a commodity. So it's a bit like how Marx understands what happens to labor. When labor goes from quality to quantity, once it becomes quantity, it becomes commodified, and then there can be a labor market and wage labor, et cetera. Maybe the last thing I'll say, in the interest of time, is actually Anders has a very complex framework to think about this question about AI venture capitalism. Because at base, the claim of Anders is irrespective of whatever ideology, whatever political agenda, whether you're, a capitalist, you're a tech bro, you're a proletariat, you belong to this community or that community, the structure of technology, of media, will change the form in which the world appears mm-hmm. to us and how we relate to it, irrespective of content, let's say, irrespective of ideology, right, left, African-American, white. The technology has its own kind of redistribution of the sensible, to use the Jacques Rancière term. And then the next layer of analysis would be then, why is it that then certain groups, certain social groups, certain forms of ideology seem to be more successful at exploiting this technology than others? And here, I would say that, maybe to be provocative, the true revolutionary force today is the right wing. I mean, if you're looking for revolution, it's the right wing. It's, January 6th coup d'etat insurrection. It's the fundamental dismantling of institutions through, the Heritage Foundation. I mean, in Europe, I just came back from Europe the rise of the AfD in Germany. So it's interesting. That's an interesting question. Why is it that the right has been more effective at mobilizing digital platforms and technology for its political revolution? In a sense, they are the true revolutionaries. And so that's the next layer of analysis. And then the third in Anders' framework is, at the end of the day, nobody is in charge of technology. I mean, that's
the ambiguity.
That's the idea of obsolescence, is that even if you get, you got your tech bros hanging around, thinking they're calling the shots, and in one sense they are, but in one sense they fundamentally are not. Because again, the true agent of history are machines and technology. And for Anders, there's no teleology to technology. So there's also a kind of an openness, which then leaves the possibility that indeed we could use technologies for more progressive ends. But then it goes back to my question, why is it that the right has been much more effective with the use of digital technologies than, for lack of a better word, call it the left? That's an interesting question. And that's a question that you can formulate quite clearly in Anders, though Anders himself takes no partisan stance in the obsolescence of the human is a book about the political in the Arendtian sense that has no politics.
Can I say something really quick just to that? I mean, I think just on that last point, I think that's exactly the thing I was just trying to say a moment ago, which is that it doesn't seem to me that with respect to this question about technology, AI, and for thinking about things, right, left at the partisan level, the left is purely just kind of operating at a level of criticism and critique, which we obviously need, because like I said, and I think you also agree, these things are not neutral. But there's no sense in which I don't think the Fanonian position would go as far as to say that machines are the agents of history, but there's no sense in which we can think about and talk about these things as ambiguous, as things that are open to being changed. That it's not completely up to us to decide what this thing is going to be. And I think the left, if we want to use that partisan language, is purely operating at a level of just criticism. And it doesn't seem to me that it moves beyond that.
Yeah, maybe one last. Again, for lack of, the left still has this 19th century idea of Prometheus. The militant is a Prometheus figure. It has to learn Prometheus. We need to have more sense of shame vis-a-vis these things, because I think the militant is a Prometheus figure in the 19th century sense.
Yeah, I guess I will start with the first question, if you don't mind. And I would say at this time, if you do have a question and you'd like to be on the recording, feel free to raise your hand. I know some people are registering comments and what have you in the chat. If you'd like to be called on, just feel free to mention that in the chat, and then we can, or just raise your hand and I'll call on you. If you don't want to be called on, but you want your comment to be recognized, feel free to put it in the chat and I can speak it out loud on the recording. Just to go back to Nicolas' point about the right being revolutionary, I mean, this is a topic and a claim that we've explored exhaustively on the podcast, and especially in terms of the mimetic dexterity of the right, their ability to sort of transform events, on the plane of signs. I mean, even January 6th was a kind of social media post at the end of the day. The one thing that January 6th couldn't accomplish is the full-blown kind of revolution, the takeover of power inside the White House. What you did have, however, was plenty of people taking pictures, dressed in costumes and, appearing in ways that were subversive at the level of signs. I mean, it leads me to think of Baudrillard's notion of symbolic exchange and his concept of irreversibility. There's an extent to which the right seems to have been successful insofar as they are able to explode discourse. Even this space that we're holding here today is a kind of vacuole of discourse that in some online spaces does not traction as well these days because of the celerity and intensity of mimetic combat that takes place. So we have these spaces to enjoy a certain, elevation of discourse and indulge meanings that are not present in those spaces. But at the same time, I wonder, just like January 6th, since they could not take control of the levers of power once inside the White House, it makes me think that their power to explode the symbolic order to an irreversible point is limited in some sense. So that seems like an opportunity for the left, some regard. And this makes me, and I'll just tack on to this as a kind of add-on, since one of the dominant modes of left-wing struggle historically has been proletarian struggle, what does the problem that we're elaborating here today mean for something like a working class struggle? Is that does that even seem a viable option in view of Anders' perspective on things, if we want to sort of lump Baudrillard in there as well, what does the proliferation of technologies, individuality, and all of the concepts that we have on the table mean for even reactivating some of these 19th century idioms for today's fight against domination?
Yeah, maybe I'll just say something briefly, since I know a lot of folks also want to contribute. I see Alex and Michael and others. I think from Anders' point of view, Anders has this interesting moment in his book where he says, Hegel was wrong. The whole is not the true, the whole is the false. And so he has this sort of diagnosis that one of the consequences of the saturation of our world through media technology, again, television is what he's looking at, is that the meaningfulness of a difference between truth and falsity has been erased. It's already kind of the simulacra thesis of Baudrillard. So there you might say that a world in which there is no meaningful sense of stability, of marking in politically efficacious terms, the distinction between truth and falsity, then in a sense, the way in which the revolutionary becomes successful is not in speaking truth to power, it's speaking falsity to power. The more you speak false things, the more powerful the more you'll be able to change the existing structure of power. So there you might say that whereas we on the left still have this, nostalgia for speaking truth to power, again, I'm speaking obviously very crudely, on the right, there's a kind of, cleverness, almost a kind of Odyssean cleverness of we need to speak falsity to power in order to gain power. And that's where then the traction and purchase of conspiracy theories, stop the steal, the war in Iran has been won 20 times since last year. I mean, all of these things actually are in themselves symptoms of a world that has been fundamentally transformed by media. That would be how Anders would sort of put it. And the last thing I'll say is Anders doesn't think that the notion of class makes sense anymore in our world. That's part of his disagreement. And I think this goes back to Craig, this Deleuzian idea of, the dividuality, a term that actually Anders himself uses. He called it dividual. Right. I think Anders has this sense that in a fully saturated media world, there's no such thing as class anymore. All there are sort of digital tribes. I sort of hang out with my folk in this digital platform, or I go to a QAnon meeting with these guys. So class has been replaced by this molecularization. And then these social spaces, which are in a sense driven by, again, a media transformation. And I think that's, now the language of echo chamber. I mean, this is more the popular idiom, but Anders already sees this already in the 50s, right, with television, that there is no class anymore. There's just viewership of shows and likes. This is my show, this is your show. Yeah.
All right. We have some hands raised. I also want to say, too, that there are some folks who are often not apt to speak. Please, you're invited. Please say something if you'd like. This is a welcoming crowd. Alexander, let's begin with you, and then we'll go to Adam after that. Go ahead, Alexander. Alex, I'm sorry.
Quite okay. Either one will get me to turn my head. Thanks to both of you. Really insightful. I came into this, as I said, having listened to both of your episodes, but still much more familiar with Fanon than Anders, just because Fanon has been much more salient for my own work. That being said, I agree with what Nicolas says about the left being too attached to 19th century formulations. And some of what I'm going to ask is kind of a sharpening of what Craig just asked. You know, we're not necessarily, and as well as maybe a way to not gently push back, but maybe get some more specificity. Certainly from you, Nicolas, but also Tyrique, feel free. I want to hear this. You know, like we, it's true. Yeah, we're all viewers and consumers, but in order to participate in that society where viewing and consuming is possible, as well as just simply keeping ourselves alive, our life outside of that, though heavily more and more mediated through digital work, through it, everything like that, still requires a certain level of work. And the conditions of that work, of that exploitation, are very different. You know, like, and you know, the people who don't have to actually participate that are the ones who are able to shape the terms of consumption and viewing on top of that. So which, as an aside, you know, has something, you know, why is it that the right has been able to mobilize technology so much to its own, what I would argue is sort of a spectacle in the situationist sense, a spectacle, a revolution of spectacle that is nonetheless very palpable right now. One of the reasons they've been able to is because the conditions of that technology, I mean, you know, AI could be a labor saving technology. Instead, it's a labor elimination technology. Current sense right now. That's just one example that hopefully illuminates kind of what I'm saying. So I guess, and I said this was going to be a sharpening of what Craig said. You know, we if we are trying to find a transformative subject right now, to what degree is that subject going to be more Luddite or more Haraway-esque? Or is it some sort of synthesis between the two? Because you look at so much of what the nascent pushback against so much, it's don't build the data center here. It's going to cook our town and it's going to wipe out all of our jobs.
Yeah.
On the other hand, technology does have that capability, that there are still people, at least for the time being, designing the program and things like that, and people who have the ability to say no, to negate things like that. And some of what I'm asking may be a little abstract and a little maybe asking you to speak on, you know, fairly abstract scenarios, but they seem to kind of concretize the problematics and the challenge that lays in front of us, or at least that's what I'm attempting to do. So I'll stop there. I would love to hear your thoughts on, like, are we talking about a new human that is more Luddite or cyborg, or some sort of synthesis between the two?
Yeah, I mean, if you will, and I think maybe just kind of picking up on that, again, just kind of thinking about some of the conceptual things I was trying to put on the table earlier, is that, to my mind, I think it really seems that if it is going to be the case that technology is something that we can take hold of again, right? If it's going to be the case that, you know, there is something like a class that is the agent of history, and it's not merely the machine that's the agent of history, you know, we have to be in a world, or start practicing living in a world, in which we don't, I think, merely immediately just passively, I think, to use the language Nicolas was using, consume, right? You cannot purely be, if this is going to be a potential possibility, the way in which these things are structured is set up such that it encourages a certain kind of passive consumerist behavior. And that kind of passivity, I think, very much conceals or hide the kind of possibilities you're talking about right now, right? And that's to my mind, and maybe this is maybe this might be where the differences lie, but to my mind, that those things can be concealed vis-a-vis the kind of behavior these machines and material things encourage does not eliminate the possibility that you can reveal something to be otherwise, right? I mean, again, to my mind, I think that's what's really instructive about that radio example. Now, of course, we can't just simply copy what worked what worked with the Voice of Algeria, but I think that image, to my mind, is a really good illustration of what kind of relationship we need to have to technology. I mean, I think we can continue to have this extremely passive one on the one hand, which I think, to my mind, is part of the reason why, like you were just saying a moment ago, it very much looks like a revolution on the right, but it really is a revolution at the level of spectacle, right? They're, consuming an image of what they think is, change. I mean, Nicolas was saying earlier, it's speaking falsity to power, but they're not, they believe that they're seeing and talking about something that's true and real, right? Even though it very much, we can see and observe that, they're speaking falsity to power. And so I think, to my mind, it's going to involve not a purely passive and consumerist attitude toward technology. And I think also that means not simply adopting a, the kind of passive slogans I think we also have on the left about, how it is we should always immediately relate to these things, right? We have to, I think, if this possibility is going to be realized, if there's going to be something like a human being or humanity that's going to be the agent of history, and if it's not going to be machinery as the agent of history, and the end of us, it has to be the case that we aren't merely prescribing a way of immediately responding to these things, but taking those things up, in our concrete situations. In the same way, I think those revolutionaries with the example of the radio were doing, right, trying to take up, what this piece of technology can mean for them, such that, to use I think a Sartrean adage from the Critique, such that new meanings in history can be revealed, right? New meanings that otherwise wouldn't have been there if you were continuing to relate to this, these pieces of things passively. New meanings that can come about when we start relating and thinking about these things actively. That, to my mind, is, I think, what kind of would be necessary if this possibility that you're speaking of can happen. But I think if, insofar as we, remain, I think passive, we are going to lead, again, to pick on something else that Sartre says, it's just going to lead to, tools being the negation of humanity rather than human beings negating the world to produce tools.
Yeah, maybe I just add a few things. I mean, from Andre's point of view, it's important to get certain distinctions right in order to diagnose the situation truly, correctly, in order then to think about the question of action and change. In that sense, he still has a kind of very classical, the philosopher is the one who just tries to figure out the conditions of intelligibility of a reality in order then to understand, change. And here, I would say there's a distinction that Anders make that he gets from Heidegger, that the essence of technology is not technological, meaning that what he's describing is not he's using particular technologies, whether we're talking about internet or television, but technology, for lack of a better word, is an ontological structure of the world. It's not first and foremost a psychology. And it's not first and foremost connected to any one particular human activity, be it labor or something else. It's the very structure of being in a world is conditioned by whatever technological artifacts exist in that historical world. And so that's the sense in which, irrespective of our psychology and our reaction to technology, the world is already structured in a certain way that makes certain kinds of meanings possible, certain kinds of action possible, and certain kinds of meaning and action not possible. Now, Anders is going to say what distinguishes our predicament vis-a-vis any age of technology, because this is true for any world, is that we are losing a sense of what it is to be in a world. This is what he calls in German Wertlosigkeit. And once you lose a sense of being in a world, then you lose your sense of orientation for the question of what it is to be a subject, what it is to act, etc. So that would be, I think for Anders, that's how I think he would reformulate your sharpening of the question. And then I think Anders would sharpen it maybe a little more precisely. The fundamental problem is the problem of literacy for Anders, not labor. So today, AI is taking jobs away, I mean, in one sense, that's an important phenomenon, but for Anders, what media does, it's a transformation of literacy. How we speak about the world, which structures how we appear to each other and therefore can act together, has now been fundamentally transformed by the nature of images and the transformation of images and the very conditions of transmittability itself. So he has this interesting thesis that, and it sounds reactionary, but what television is doing, it's producing fundamental illiteracy. Because in a sense, we are bespoke as creatures. We are already spoken for by the images, the language that we get on, in television, etc. So that's the Anders. It's not so much about the 19th century problem of labor alienation. Machines are taking over labor. I mean, for Anders, rightly or wrongly, that's a very Marxist way of framing the problem of technology, always with regard to the problem of labor. Anders, in a sense, is more interested in saying that it's the structure of how the world is manifest and appears as a function of phenomena, how it appears, but also logos, how we speak about the world, because how we speak about the world shapes how the world appears, and how the world appears shapes of how we speak. I mean, in that sense, he's very much following Heidegger. There is no way in which the world appears without how it speaks to us and how we speak about it. And there's no form of speaking, which is itself a way in which the world appears. And that's what he thinks media is transforming in a historically unprecedented way.
Right. Thank you. We have Adam. Go for it, Adam.
Thank you both so much. Okay, so I've been reading Butler all day, so forgive me if this is just incredibly Butlerian and if it gets off track, just be like, that doesn't work. We'll move on. Okay, so Craig started by asking about a kind of universal humanity and the possibility of that. Like, can we still gesture to that? And Tyrique, in your answers to Alex, you said "we" quite often, and so when Fanon's talking about who's going to be violent, and again, I'm going to be speaking broadly about Fanon and Anders from a place of ignorance, so please correct or dismiss anything that's off. He's speaking, it seems, to a continuity of people who are the colonized, right? And so there's like a group of people who can be like, we are in a condition that is a shared condition, and to some degree this is replicable, so these people can act in a way that makes sense in their collectivity. And then, of course, Fanon at the end imagines that Marxism will kind of unite all of us, and that will be like a humanity that can exist. Meanwhile, for Anders, we have a certain kind of like humanity, the universal humanity of like the disaffected and disinvested, the person for whom technology is shaping a reality that is always already prepared for them. And that one, of course, is this kind of anti-universal humanism, but it's still kind of this universal condition. So then when I was reading Butler and Butler's, I'm reading Gender Trouble. And so Butler's indictment of like a univocity and the idea of everyone agreeing, like the idea of like a collective agreement to a political project before engaging in a political project, and that being a problem of the left in the 90s. But if I'm trying to like put this kind of Anders idea of a technology that in certain ways preconditions our ability to experience the world. And so in a world, fast forward to now, where we're hyper fragmented, and there isn't really a specific collectivity that we can participate in that isn't already mediated by not being together. And I think that's like a left issue, right? Like, you know, when Butler does this, it's like, wow, you're right. We need to be more fragmented. And Tyrique, if I was understanding, even in your response, even when you were saying we, you were talking about a we that is still historically, geographically, and materially connected to a space. And that's kind of Fanon's intervention, right? Like the praxis ideas. Like there's stuff going on here, wherever here is, and we are here, and we interact with here. So I'm wondering if all of this, to ask my question, is part of what's going on is that in the same way that Nicolas, you were saying that the militant is a 19th century kind of idea of like the leftist Promethean hero, is that what we're seeing more and more about kind of the last iteration of like great thinkers in like leftist theoretical political um, ideation like Butler et al. Is that it isn't the Marxist Maoist kind of like pseudo fascist, you know, not fascist but kind of fascist because everybody has to agree, or we send you to the gulag, or we kill you, you go to the camps or whatever. Like that leftist thinking in the West, at least in America, has become inundated partially through this kind of technological framework that we're within, but also as a response to the failures of the past that resists any kind of collectivity that could be universalized in any way. That for us, that's like, and here I'm saying us, right? For the left, that becomes this unacceptable idea because that way always leads to like a popularist fascistic kind of reality. And so is that viable? And then if that's viable, what do you do with that? How do you get, because my immediate answer is like, why is the right more successful? It's because they're willing to be violent and the left is not. Like they're willing to have ice and the left is not. Like the Democrats are not leftists. They're on the right, but they're just not that on the right. And then you have like AOC and Mamdani who are like progressive and are like trying to change shit up, and it's exciting. So maybe that's this other thing that could happen, but I don't know that that's a successful answer. That they're just willing to be violent, and so I'm wondering about this kind of these other like environmental factors that are maybe would make collectivity unviable. Anyways, thank you.
Well, I mean, I think there's two important things. I'll just in your comments, Adam. So it's interesting that in the short essay on radio free Algeria, so this essay that Fanon writes about, you know, Tyrique had mentioned this, you know, radios were introduced in Algeria under colonialism, French radios, and they were there to broadcast, you know, sort of a transmission from France, which was to enforce colonial system, etc. And then Fanon talks about how, on the one hand, this is great. Radios are now introduced, you know, new technology in Algeria, but all the Algerians know that this is just a channel for French ideology, and itself is a kind of technology of colonialism itself. So then Fanon says, look, Algerians then just started their own radio stations, the FLN, and had kind of an alternative. And that, for Fanon, is a kind of revolutionary act. We don't have to listen to the French radio. We have our own radio. I would say that's the right today. That's the right 20, 30 years ago, who perceived that, you know, the dominant political culture that was on the ascendancy, and of course the Obama presidency was the flashpoint for them, was that they were excluded from media. And so then basically they opted out and had the technological means to create alternative media spaces in which, just as Fanon describes it as a virtue for the FLN, the right has taken that very strategy for the right. And that's why you have this tremendous assault against the media, which is now legitimated, right? That the media is left-wing bias and it's woke, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the strategy of the media allows you to opt out of a reality, a political reality, in which consensus, you would be forced to enter into a political process that's not a zero-sum game. I have to make a consensus and compromise with the antagonist if I am in the same public space. But now if I can have public spaces that are created through technological means, different radio station, online chat groups, then I don't have to enter into a public space where I have to compromise or negotiate. In a sense, I can alternate between just being a bully and making verbal threats, violence in that sense, or just completely ignoring what's going on. And here you would say, I would say that's the valence of our politics. It's some violence in some form. We're going to blow shit up. We're going to hit them harder. Tonight, we're going to destroy a civilization. You know, I mean, language that doesn't resonate with us anymore, because this is, of course, war crime language, but people are like, oh, it's just, you know, another tweet online, or just complete ignorance. Like, we're out of here. This is not important. So it's either you are completely indifferent and you don't engage, or your only mode of engagement is violence, to your point. I think Anders would say that's enabled by the material conditions of the technology. That's the Anders hypothesis. So maybe you're right. The left needs to engage in a kind of violence in order to counteract this violence, which both violences are themselves conditioned or symptoms of the technological environment themselves. I think that's how Anders would think through your comments, Adam. And I think Butler succumbs to the same problem. There's no discussion of technology and media in any substantial way in Butler's thinking, as far as I know. I mean, it's almost as if you put all her works in a time capsule 100 years from now, and there was no other document, no one would know that computers and technology exist in our world if you just read Butler's books. You could read them in the 19th century and say, look, in the 19th century, Butler's books would be as intelligible as they are, because you don't have a sense that our world is saturated, that there's a new agent, there's a new kind of power that's operative here. And that would be Anders, what he calls apocalyptic blindness, the blindness to the apocalyptic, if you wish, the deleterious effects of the technology. That blindness is produced by the technology itself.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only thing I would add is there's, I guess, more of a clarificatory note with respect to the we and whatnot. I'm not sure how this will bear on technology, but I think it's important, at least to my mind, to underscore, I think, two senses of the existential as it shows up in Fanon, and I think that basically, I think that generation of writers, which is, I think, at the one level, I think this is the Butler point. I think this is the point that, broadly speaking, the left is hyperfixated with, which is existence, at the level of, my lived experience, right? That, I live in the world as, colonized, I live in the, you live in the world in this other way, etc., which is, very much a form of existence that we do need to be attentive to. Fanon's attentive to it. He talks about it in the culture section. He's thinking about, well, we need a combat literature, but the combat literature is going to be specific in, Guinea, and it's going to be different in Algeria, right? That's that level of existential. But I think it's important to remember that, that's one level of existential that itself is only made possible by this other level of existential, which is the form in which one can even have an experience as, colonized, colonist, black, white, etc., right? And this is, I think this is the universalism that I think a lot of people on the left are still, for better or worse, allergic to. I mean, I think personally for worse, allergic to a certain kind of, a general form of experience that we do all share, a form of experience that lets it be possible for, you to be situated in these conditions and me to be situated in these conditions, but a universal experience that nonetheless we can all appeal to. And that's the thing I think that Fanon's trying to reintroduce with respect to a new humanism, right? New in the sense that, you can say new in the sense that, it's a form of humanism that doesn't exist, because whether it's bourgeois or Renaissance humanism, that was always about a very particularly situated existence, right? Europe at this particular time. And so this new humanism is not that, but I think new in the novel, or, for lack of a better word, in the phenomenological tradition, originary sense, right? An originary humanism for which other forms of humanism is possible. And so when I talk about we, and then when I think, when I'm talking about Fanon and we, I think that's kind of what I have in mind. And I think, this emphasis, by people like Butler and others to say, well, what we need is more fragmentation, what we need is more difference, ignores the fact that at the end of the day, we map onto one world. And I think what the right partially get correct is that there is a world that they're sharing, right? There is very much a world that they're sharing, which means, I can be in Omaha, and you can be in Kentucky, but, there's a certain thing that we're sharing, and they're, trying to kind of speak about that and trying to bring that into being when they meet. And to one extent, and on the one hand, yeah, they're fragmented in that sense, but on the other hand, they're trying to appeal to what they believe, they're truly sharing. Now we can ask whether or not, that's the fullest sense in which one can share a world with others. But I think these two levels of existential are operative. And I think if we want to think about particular possibilities, it's important to keep both of those things in mind.
Great. Thank you. Ben Horn, if you would go ahead. You're muted, Ben.
Sorry, wrong button. Thank you so much for the truly wonderful contributions. One of the things that I also wanted to contribute in terms of the intersection between this kind of apocalyptic blindness, technological mediation, and figures of making and unmaking humanity is an idea that I've come across recently in terms of what's called a kind of martial epistemology, which I've unfortunately forget the name of the theorist that like actually coined a term thus, but it has to do with the category of ontoepistemology, which seems to come up latently in Anders, but perhaps more explicitly in Fanon, where indeed whatever we can know about the world is also inseparable from how we produce knowledge of the world as well. I'm thinking in particular of Fanon's concept of sociogeny and sociodiagnosis. The reason that I bring this up is because I think that many of the technologies that we're seeing right now in terms of the use of AI, automated systems and automated warfare is very much an extension of the colonial logics of imperialist warfare that were tried in arenas such as Vietnam, wherein so many of these allegedly advanced military systems were created specifically to map out the terrain of colonized territories and indeed to keep scope of populations that could potentially be considered enemies as well. And one of the things I've similarly noticed is there's kind of been a shift potentially now from the Foucauldian disciplinary society through the Deleuzian architecture of the control society to something that I wonder if you can draw on like Philip K. Dick for actually is the idea of we have now is a kind of normativity without a norm, how there is an attempt to generate a baseline for how an enemy should act, and thus, but from the data itself, rather than constructing a kind of ideal type in the Foucauldian sense, and therefore trying to frame any deviation from this imminent baseline as grounds for determination. This, of course, means that particularly for colonized subjects in this hyper-technologized and mediated era, virtually anyone and everyone can become a, to use the language of the late Charles Mills, a mobile free fire zone. And what I think that we are kind of seeing now in terms of the operation of these technologies like AI as a kind of like vast de-skilling enterprises, but also the use of these technologies in ICE identification, in checkpoints, and how officials in, say, the US State Department, like Stephen Miller, have openly been saying, like, no, we want to now we don't care about like performing background checks. We want to see people like arresting over like 2,000 people a day, right? So what we actually see now is the use all these kinds of techniques of baseline manufacturing and enemy detection as a deliberate process of making and unmaking humanity. So I think it's really interesting the kinds of dialogues that we've been having in terms of contesting the form of not simply the residual humanism or a kind of reactionary humanism that has been deployed by the mainstream right as well, like to say, oh well, if you find yourself on the opposite side of this kind of martial baseline, then that means you are innately seen as less human and thus like worthy of whatever horrible consequences will befall you. Like we'll throw you in a gulag, like we'll throw you like in detention facilities. But specifically, how we could potentially utilize the different technological infrastructures open as a method of releasing people from this kind of reactionary humanism as a way of like trying to do without this kind of base interpretation. But yeah, I am really interested to hear people's responses to this. Thank you.
I mean, thank you, Ben. Maybe I'll just seize on one particular point in the various topics that you raised. The transformation of warfare through AI, drone technologies, etc. I think that's a really complicated question. I don't think it maps on so clearly as maybe you suggested between colonial practices, which are now propagated in a different context in, you know, drone warfare, etc. Because, I mean, if you look at the history of warfare in colonial context, one of the things that you see is repeatedly the way in which so-called technologically less inferior populations are nonetheless able to resist militarily technologically superior, namely Western powers, and the way in which then Western military thinking has itself to adapt to the encounter with different styles of warfare. I mean, I can be very, very specific. The introduction of light infantry in European armies that begins basically here in North America in King Philip's War, etc., where the British Army had to encounter indigenous peoples who have a very different conception of warfare and fighting, and then had to sort of redesign their own warfighting skills. So there, I think it's a really complicated question. Oh, Ben Horn's gone. Maybe the last thing I'll say is the thing about drones is interesting. I don't know if you are familiar with a French anthropologist called Chamaillou, who wrote a book called Drone Theory that came out maybe 10 years ago. Grégoire Chamaillou. He has a really interesting argument that what drones have done, and I think now we see 10 years later, his thesis is absolutely correct, is that warfare, traditionally understood, involves reciprocity of violence. I expose myself to violence and you expose yourself to violence. I shoot at you, you shoot at me, etc. But what drones introduces a kind of fundamental asymmetry in warfare, because I can be safely at an Air Force base in Nevada commanding a drone that's firing a missile into a girls' school or whatever in Iran, and I'm not exposed to any kind of violence. Mm-hmm. And so he argues that now warfare has become hunting. That's his thesis. And he actually wrote an earlier book called Man the Hunter, which is a kind of an anthropology of humans hunting humans. And there is a connection with colonial warfare. Because one of the ways in which war was developed in certain colonial contexts was that it was understood not as warfare, but as a kind of hunting, especially for capturing of slaves, And so there is a sense in which a colonial logic of warfare transforms warfare into an activity of hunting prey. And it's not surprising that one of the earliest American drones is called a Predator, right? And so there you see a kind of colonial logic of violence, which has replicated and reproduced itself because of a certain kind of technology.
Yeah.
On the other hand, Ukraine is a good example of how Ukraine, inferior militarily, economically to Russia, is able to mobilize drones in a way that it's almost like the David and Goliath story. So again, I think Anders would say there's something fundamentally neutral about technology. It can move in any way, and that's part of the ambiguity. And so you can give one historical example where drone technology allows a superior power like the US to now, project its colonialization and transform warfare into hunting. On the other hand, you can give another example, Ukraine, where the very same technology is giving a very different kind of effect. And that's the Anders neutrality thesis or the ambiguity thesis, the ambivalence of technology.
Yeah, I mean, just to add a bit to that, I mean, I think it's important just to pick out something you said and to draw again on this ambiguity language. And I like that. I like that language a bit more than I think technology in itself is neutral. I think the ambiguity language is a bit stronger because I think it helps shows that, it's going to appear in particular ways to different people. So like you just said, with the Predator missile, right? Obviously that appears in a non-neutral way to those who are going to be, destroyed by that. And then similarly for, the David Goliath story you're saying with Ukraine, that same technology is going to appear in a certain way for them. But I think speaking to the ambiguity thing and just to pull out something you just said a moment ago, I mean, I think it's the fact that you name, you name, a person, right? Like Stephen Miller, right? Behind, for example, not just drone technology, but also what kind of things we want these technologies to do, ICE and whatnot. That, to my mind, again, speaks to the fact that these things only work with our interfacing of them, right? Ultimately, right? And I think I think that above all, I think that's a position that I think, both Fanon and Anders would definitely share, which is that, these things have no potency, whether we want to call them agents or not, they have no potency without our interfacing with them, right? And now obviously we can cache those things out in different ways, and I think that's what we've been doing. But somebody like Stephen Miller, right, as passively as he's relating to this technology as a means to kind of carry out some, project he's inherited, at the end of the day, his passive activity is still an activity. He's still doing something, and as long as he continues doing that, that technology will continue to serve those ends, ends of a project that isn't really Stephen Miller's, qua Stephen Miller, but nonetheless a human project, right? And I think that bit I think is quite important. I mean, not just at the level of moralizing, right? Not just at the level of being able to call him out and say X, Y, Z, but again to kind of recognize that there's a kind of passive agency at work here that is allowing this technology to serve some kind of dead project, right? And if we want to talk about change, we would need to think about it a kind of active agency, which again I think speaks to this kind of ambiguity of the technology, a kind of a thinking of technology as ambiguous that I think is completely absent from I think a lot of the discussion about what technology is and how it should operate.
We're riding up on 9 o'clock, which would make this 2 hours. And just to respect Nicolas and Tyrique's time, I think we might cut it off unless there's an absolutely pressing question that somebody needs to have asked here in this discussion. Well, with that said, Nicolas, do you guys want
to? Well, I think Ben, the AHRC wanted to say.
Oh, I'm sorry. Ben.
But also I would say, I mean, Ben, please go ahead. But also Tyrique and I are also happy to receive digital emails.
Sure, sure.
My
Yeah,
conversation.
I can hang out for a little bit more. Ben, I'm sorry. I noticed your hand is down. Did you still want to ask a question?
Oh, just real quick,
Yeah.
for those of us who, for the life of us, can't pronounce or understand French, can you text into the chat the name of the author from Drone Theory?
Yeah, Grégoire Chamaillou. I'll do it right now. You know, I think it's published by Verso, or it's called Drone Theory is the name of the book. In French, it has a different title, but doesn't matter. There it is. It's a great book, absolutely fantastic book. He's an anthropologist. It's an anthropology of drones and drone warfare.
Okay. I think this might be a good time to wrap up the discussion then, since otherwise we'll probably go until like 9:45 if we do one more question. But with that said, Nicolas and Tyrique, I not only want to thank you for doing the panel, but your contributions over the summer. Those classes are in the archive. If you're already subbed to the archive, you can go access them. If you aren't and you're a patron, there's deep discounts. You could even access it for free. If you look at nobody took any of the free subscriptions at the beginning of this month. But people have subscribed for paid amounts, which tells us that they want to support us, and we're happy about that. But feel free to take advantage of what is offered. Nicolas, Tyrique, thanks again. We hope to have you back to do something at some point. And of course, I'm local, so I'm going to have a coffee or something with you sometime very soon.
Thank you to you all for your participation and for the great conversation.
Yes, thank you. And again, like I said at the beginning, I think in particular, in general, I don't like this notion of timeliness, but I think it's very, very timely to kind of have this conversation in this forum. And I think, yeah, so thanks again, Craig, for letting this happen.
Great. All right. Take care, folks, and have a wonderful night.
A great